In the last video I showed you some examples of small-scale disaster events, what I called everyday disasters. According to the UN, a huge majority of disaster events are at this scale. I said there was some evidence that these might account for a lot of disaster losses, but there's very little data about what's really going on. So, I worked on a project called Views from the Frontline, which set out to find out more. The idea was, in crude terms, a massive customer survey. After all, countries are meant to protect their citizens, their customers, from experiencing disasters, and there's a whole UN system to coordinate this globally. So, was it delivering the goods? This project didn't have a bunch of scientists or a hefty research budget, but what it did have was the enthusiastic and passionate participation of people in many small NGOs dotted around the world who'd united into the Global Network for Disaster Reduction. They wanted customers to be heard. Now, the UN had their own monitoring system for this, but it just asked member governments how things were going. How would their results compare with ours? Not surprisingly, our survey got very different results to theirs. In the first, we interviewed over 7,000 people in 48 low-income and middle-income countries. This grew to over 21,000 people in later surveys. Customers we asked said not much was changing. There was a huge gap between the goals the UN and its member countries set out for disaster reduction and what actually happened on the ground. I saw this, for example, when I was taken to see a bridge in rural South Nigeria. Well, the remains of the bridge. It had been washed away in the seasonal floods and its remains would only carry foot traffic. The thing was, this was the only access route to several villages. So the villagers were starved of supplies. A local NGO had been working with the local government to get it rebuilt, but they couldn't get the funding they needed from central government. Seemed like it wasn't a priority in the government offices. This was just one of many thousands of local everyday disasters, ignored and unreported, which knocked back people's lives. Where should government's priorities lie if they really wanted to drive down the effects of these disasters? We decided to ask people for their own experience and ideas. After all, they were often far from being passive customers. Since they know a lot about disasters, we got them to tell us through many consultations and conversations, which were recorded, gathered together and analysed so we could get some solid data on how these unreported everyday disasters were affecting people's lives. Our findings reinforced the fact that the main threats people faced were from these small-scale everyday disasters, often magnified or even created by the way towns and cities were organised. What do they think are the most critical disasters to tackle? When they're asked what the next generation will face, which is a really interesting way of coming at it, most of their concerns were with social and economic threats. While flooding and drought are clearly major concerns, unemployment was level pegging with them. And the threats posed by climate change, epidemics, poverty, crime, conflict and drug addiction were high on their list. And what was most scary about our findings, and the UN was finding this too, was that these threats were increasing. Despite all the efforts of disaster risk reduction, global risk is growing. The Global Views from the Frontline customer survey on disasters produced a lot of data revealing local knowledge about the kind of disasters that continually affect people's lives. But it raised an even bigger and unanswered question. If many of these threats are tied up with how our societies are organised, with poverty, unemployment, insecurity, climate change and so on, what lies behind them? And what's making these losses grow? Are shadowy disaster makers driving growing risk? How? We're going to tackle that question in the next video. If you found this video useful in understanding disasters, subscribe to this channel as we explore disaster makers and check out the Disaster Makers book.